So, briefly, just introducing who we are. My name is Jonathan. I'm working in the Safety and Accident Investigation Centre at Cranfield University. We recently celebrated 40 years of teaching accident investigation, so we have our own aircraft and our own airfield, which is unique among all the universities in Europe. One of the only other universities that has its own airport is actually Embry-Riddle in the US, which is another aerospace-focused university. So we do a lot of very cool stuff for aerospace. So what I'm talking about today is about precision touchdown. We want to know exactly why and where the aircraft touched down. Why do we want to know this? It's because sometimes stuff goes wrong. This was a flight in Canada where it was coming in. It was a little bit high on the approach. It landed deep. It was raining. It was wet. And they just didn't stop in time, and they ran off the end of the runway. There were no casualties. It was all really straightforward. But it's an example of what can go wrong if stuff goes wrong. And in order to improve our understanding of how to avoid stuff like that happening in the future and worse incidents, we need to have better understanding about how often people land, where they intend to land. And as I'll try to explain, we don't have as good a grasp on that as you might think. We have good understanding of where, as you may have heard from the last speaker, about where galaxies are and how far away they are. But something as simple as where an aircraft touched down exactly on the runway is actually a little bit more elusive. So what we do within large civil air transport is we have what's called a safety management system, where we try to identify all the hazards we've got. We try to prioritise which are the most important. We try to find some way to control them, to monitor them, and just to keep iterating around and trying to continually improve the safety of our organisation. This often involves large amounts of simulator time for the pilots, and so what we'd like to do is we'd like to create realistic scenarios that can help them actually improve in something that's actually going to happen or is more critical. If you may remember, a couple of years ago, we had the Miracle on the Hudson. That was a pilot who was actually, on his own time, doing simulator training for just that kind of incident. And that's the kind of benefits you can have if you can target the kind of incidents that are actually going to crop up. So being able to understand exactly what's going on and do statistics about the various factors that are going into these incidents and causing them can really help in terms of improving safety within the organisation. So on an aircraft, as you might expect, we have a ton of sensors. I mean, literally, there is more than a ton of sensors. We have the airspeed, we have all the various flight controls, we have the angle of the flaps, we have the angle of the ailerons, the angle of the tail, the rudder. All of it's monitored, and all of it's logged at the same rate, and it all comes through a system. So you have what's called a DAFDAU, or DMU, which is a Digital Flight Data Acquisition Unit, or Data Management Unit, and it goes into one of two places. It goes into what you may have heard of before, the black box. It's the orange one, which is the flight data recorder, and also what's called a QAR, which is a quick access recorder. Now, the QAR is what we actually spend more of our time with, because between flights, someone will go out and, I kid you not, with a USB stick, or sometimes it's a legacy serial cable, like you might have had on a very old printer, and sometimes, and I prefer not, but sometimes wireless or Bluetooth, and they will download the data from the last couple of flights, so we can log it into the system. So someone has to go to the aircraft and touch it, but we can get the data out on a reasonably regular basis, so we can log it and we can put it into the system, or we would if it wasn't all in binary. Most of you will probably recognise hexadecimal, which is based on the understanding that you've translated 8-bit bytes into hex code, which is only 16. However, I'm showing you hexadecimal, but it's completely irrelevant because actually flight data recorders, according to international standard, record in 12-bit words, just to be helpful. So we have to go from this 12-bit word format, and it's a fixed frame data layout, and because we're trying to be efficient, and it comes from the days when 8 bits was a big thing, you end up having different variables interleaved. So you'll have the most significant bits from one variable overlapping with the least significant bits of another variable, which can cause weird artifacts. But if you have some system, and there are various different ways you can go from this binary data, as long as you have what's called the LFL, the logical frame layout, where you're being told within that fixed frame where all the variables are and what they mean and how to translate them from their binary representation into an engineering unit, then you can get a CSV file out of it. Some people will sadly have to depend upon systems that still run on Windows 3.1. This is very sad. But, this is the future with Python. Someday, I might actually be able to do it if it wasn't all copyrighted. So that sadly is something that will have to remain currently in the dark ages. But once we get the data out, we can actually start doing useful things with it. It's not really big data in the sense you might think, because we've got a data set at Cranfield, which is about 10 years of a major domestic carrier. So that's about 18 terabytes. It's a reasonable chunk of data, and it takes a while to do stuff with it, but it's not big data in the sense that you're probably more familiar with. But we do have some problems, and that most of us are aerospace engineers. We can go into great detail about the dynamics of the aircraft and the speed and things like compressibility effects and whether the wings are structurally sound enough and is the maintenance being done. But in terms of programming, we're really more fond of MATLAB. And indeed, my PhD was done almost entirely in MATLAB. And it's a wonderful tool, but it really isn't quite as flexible as you might want. So about 2 years ago, I touched Python for the first time, and it's been an adventure. And I have to say, it's absolutely fantastic. Just seeing what we can actually do with this stuff. So I've put down there that it's exploring versus processing, and Python has been much more useful than MATLAB has been for that particular type of thing, where I'm spending more time exploring the data than I am actually doing rigid computation. So this is what flight data looks like when you've actually got it out. This is what is a missed approach. So the aircraft's coming around, and they've decided actually they don't want to land here today, so they're climbing a bit more up, turning around and coming back. It's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? It's just so many different lines overlaid. There is an axis, but I've just left it off just to kind of show you what's actually happening in terms of the thing that is important within flight data is the relationship of one variable to another. One trace on its own is almost irrelevant. What you need to know is the stuff like the speed in relation to the altitude, in relation to the temperature outside, so you can actually find out what the Reynolds number is, so you can get what the air density was, which will tell you something about the flight properties of the aircraft. So it's very contextual. And these are just some of the continuous variables. We actually have a lot of logical variables as well. Not all of them are Boolean. Some of them have 3, 4, 5 logical states. The undercarriage is one particular example, because you might have undercarriage down and locked, undercarriage coming up, undercarriage stowed, undercarriage going down. And these are all logical values that are also stored in the flight data at some frequency. So working out where touchdown happened, we can be reasonably certain about when it happened. So this is some accelerometer data from an aircraft as an example. I've plotted the normal acceleration, which is the one you might normally associate with gravity, which is why you can see that the blue line is based around 1, because it's normal Earth gravity. And then the red line is longitudinal, which is fore and aft. As you can see, there's two major areas of interest. On the red line, you can see that there's a sudden spike in positive longitudinal acceleration. That's when you get that push back into the seat as the aircraft accelerates for takeoff. And at the other side, you can see there's a negative spike. This is when it's braking after landing. And around those two, you'll get a lot of activity in the normal acceleration, because you're bumping as you go along the runway. And you also have this much bigger spike when you land. This is key for us, because we can look for that big spike on landing after doing some stuff to filter out the other portions of the flight where there's just a bit of turbulence, or filtering out those bits of the flight where it's actually just taxiing after landing, that sort of thing. But we can actually find that. But we do have to do a lot of filtering, because you do get these artifacts in the data, most of which are due to the effect of doing variable wrapping. Because we only have a very large amount of space in the flight data recorder, in order to get more range out of any particular variable, typically there will be wraps. So when you're coming back to look at it, you have to be careful and find out where they wrapped. And it's not necessarily always straightforward discovering that. And then also, because you get interleaving between different variables, you'll sometimes get just spurious things where there's been a conversion error. And we can't really get away from them for the moment, because a lot of this stuff is legacy systems, that, as I mentioned, some of which still runs on Windows 3.1. But we can eventually do it, and we can get into pandas, which make everything so much nicer. On this note, actually, my colleague did some stuff in R, because he was very interested in finding out how much time pilots spend actually flying, hands on the stick. And it turns out for 95% of the time, they spend less than 7 minutes in an actual flight, actually flying the aircraft. The rest of the time, it's the autopilot. And while I may have my own opinions about which of those systems is safer for flying the aircraft, we're interested in the human experience here. So for touchdown, this is what I wrote a little thing to try and visualize from the flight data we have all the touchdowns in my data set for one particular airport, which is Jersey. I'll go into why Jersey in a minute. But this is using a library called GeoPandas, which is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it. There's a little module I wrote myself called Aerospace GIS, which is just about interrogating OpenStreetMap using the OverPy library and constructing a structured map of an airfield using that data so we can then plot what's in there. You'll see I'm using the Shapely library as well because I can then create these points. I can then do points versus other points, seeing if they're within certain areas, like whether they're within a taxiway, whether they're near the runway, doing an intersection of a trajectory with a taxiway or runway. You can start to do really good operations in terms of understanding the geometry. The reason I'm using Shapely instead of rolling my own or doing something that's more bespoke is because the Earth is spherical, and it's not even nicely spherical. So I leave that to the geographers, and they can help me with their libraries. So if I just quickly come over here. So this is Jersey. This is OpenStreetMap with their fantastic thing, and the Folium library created this map. And you can see there's no points plotted there. And I haven't made a mistake. You can see just down at the bottom, there's a little radio marker, and there's another little one there. And if I go up and zoom out, I don't think that's where the aircraft touched down. The problem is the latitude and longitude is recorded in what's called short format to save space. Because at the end of the day, we know the aircraft touched down because it's at that airport. So it obviously touched down at the runway. And that, in the days when this was created, they weren't really looking to do analysis of touchdown locations for safety reasons. They were looking for where did the aircraft fly in a kind of a gross sense. It was more the contextual, where did the aircraft head and what were the accelerations, which is why things like the normal acceleration have a much higher data rate than latitude and longitude. But it does hinder me in this particular piece of research, which is unfortunate. Right, so if we go back. So this is the reason I chose Jersey. On the approach, there is this very nice little terrain feature as you come out across the sea, and then it goes up over the dunes, and then you get the runway, which means that there's something I can actually match against if I can reconstruct the ground track, the ground terrain under the aircraft using what's called the radar altimeter. The radar altimeter is just it's a radio that sends a pulse down to the Earth and it gets a return. And then based on the profile of that return, it can guess how high the aircraft is above the ground. And by looking at that and profiling all the returns we get, we can construct the terrain profile below the aircraft. And if we do some normalization by taking the barometric altitude of the aircraft after it's landed to give us our zero, then we can actually offset that the correct amount so that it matches up against the true terrain. And then by translating it, we can then do some matching to work out how deep or short the aircraft actually land on the runway, which is fantastic. This is what pilots are supposed to be aiming for. They're not. They don't. They have their own opinions. It's called the Precision Approach Point Indicator. It's a set of lights to show them from very far away where they're supposed to be aiming for. And you can see there's some white markers as well. They're physically quite large, so you wouldn't think pilots are able to miss them, but there we go. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to import the data. We're going to select for the airport we want. We're going to clean it up to try and move the artifacts. We're going to zero the radar altimeter using the barometric altitude of the airport once we've landed. The reason we have to do that is because it drifts slightly over time, a slightly different temperature, slightly more rain, humidity. All these things can affect the barometric altitude. So you end up with it offset by a couple of meters, which just ruins the whole effect. Once we've done that, we can fit a spline to the terrain and the radar altimeter profile, and then do a translation search to minimize the root mean square error between those two. This is relatively simplistic, but it's just scikit-learn. I just love it because it's just made it so easy to do this bit. It's just all the other bit that was more difficult. And then once I've got a match, I can then put it in the database and we can plot it. So if I pop out of here again. Right, so what you can see there is that the black line is the terrain profile I've created using the radio altimeter data, and then the blue line is once it's actually been fitted to the real terrain. And you can see these red marker is the extent of the runway, This black line is where they're supposed to have touched down. The blue line is where, in this instance, they actually touched down. And this is a plot in bokeh, which is also I highly recommend if you want to have a play around with data and you're just trying to get a sense for what's really happening. I used to use a lot of Matplotlib, but I was just converted by stuff like having the ability to do this, zoom in and out, which when you have very odd artifacts and when you're trying to get the relationship and you can link different plots together, that's just absolutely fantastic. So I really do recommend the bokeh library. And so this is about 400 flights all overlaid. And you can see there's quite a reasonably good correlation between the flights that we've been converting into this spline and the actual terrain underlying, which is famous. So we can do some kernel density estimation. I should note I will be doing some code snippets for the bits I found the most fantastic from Python or the most helpful. Not because they're the most beautifully written code. Full disclaimer, I'm an aerospace engineer, not a programmer. But just because I found them very useful for what I was doing. So this is Matplotlib kernel density estimation. And you can see we're getting quite good agreement in terms of where we're getting our returns versus where the terrain actually is. There's always going to be gaps and holes because although the radio altimeter is a continuous variable that's being displayed to the pilots in real time, it's not logged at that rate. I mean, nothing in that set is logged at over 8 hertz, which will always give you some offset between adjacent data points. So this is what I end up doing, because although I only do, in this particular instance, on 390 flights, the full data set is over 400,000. So I had to do some power processing. And I found the multiprocessing library, which is built in Python 3, absolutely fantastic. I did play around with a lot of different ones in Python 2.7, and I found multiprocessing was, in the end, the easiest to use because, I mean, it's just 2 lines. And most of that was just packaging the inputs up so that they iterate correctly. And just, style map it. It was good.
Does that work across all the functions as targets or majority of the ones?
Well, it worked across all the ones I tried to use it with. So where I might use a for loop to iterate over all the different configurations, all the different input files I needed to do very similar operations to, and then spit out the results somewhere. Because my files are about 30 megabytes each, I tended to pass a temporary file, a named temporary file, using, again, it's another inbuilt library, the temp file library, so that I could keep it all in area and the computer knows that it can flush it all away if it needs to, because it's just being home template. It meant I could pass large amounts of data into this without having to pass it all in the function. It's just, so I'm really just passing the arguments and the file location, not everything in memory. Because even I know that's a bad idea. But yeah, it really was quite straightforward. The reason it's got map_func there and not the actual function name was because I used the partial library to do the keyword arguments separately. But otherwise it would have just been the analysis call. You can see a little bit closer up, we can extract lots of logical stuff from the data as well because it's using pandas. These yellow lines, this is actually the thrust reversers. These are some of those logical values I was talking about. I was trying to validate things like where they turned off the taxiway and when they're doing certain operations and why they're landing deep or long. And what's actually happening here is these 2 little yellow lines, this is when they deployed the thrust reversers. For some reason they did it asymmetrically, first one wing then the other. And then the next yellow line is actually where they stowed them back again. So what happens after you landed is the thrust reversers will pop out and help slow the aircraft down because they're redirecting the thrust so that you get a bit more of a braking effect. And then when you don't need it anymore, you don't want to stop on the runway. You want to continue moving just enough that you can taxi off the runway. So they'll stow the thrust reversers again. So by looking at where these happen relative to the taxiways, you can go, well, actually, yes, that looks like that was correct. Because the offset, it matches the terrain quite nicely. And then also the aircraft leaves the taxiway, the correct location. You can see some other stuff on this point here as well. That you've got velocity and you've got altitude. The reason why there's a red and a green is because the red one is the radio altimeter, the raw radio altimeter. So you can see this big step as it passes over the edge of the cliff. And the green is the barometric altitude, which you can see has this little dip, which is reflected in the little dip up there. That's because as the plane goes through its pitch to go actually land onto the runway, the altitude, the barometric altitude is being taken out. The position of the sensor changes, so it will go through a sudden change in the reported altitude, which doesn't matter as a reporting error because the pilots aren't looking at that particular point, they're looking at the runway. And then velocity, one's ground speed, one's airspeed, which is a meaningful difference. Ground speed is what you need to plot, airspeed is what the aircraft needs to know, because if it flies too fast or too slow, it can fall out of the sky, which is always a little bit inconvenient. And the reason why we have to have them separately is because you can have different winds. So if you've got the wind going directly into you, you'll have a low ground speed but a high airspeed. If you've got the wind, a tailwind, so it's pushing you, you'll have a higher ground speed and potentially a lower airspeed. So working out the difference and understanding why and making sure that things check with each other is part of the contextuality of this. So this is how I was doing trajectory. I mentioned before that working with a spherical coordinate frame is a pain. But there's the GeoPy library, and it's absolutely fantastic because it can do spherical distance calculations. Because the shortest route between 2 points in a Cartesian space is a straight line. On the surface of a sphere, or a geoid, as I believe the cartographers like to refer to it, it's actually what's called a great circle distance. So by using this Vincenti distance function, we can actually get, for the actual geoid with the real latitude and longitude, the actual distance travelled. So by combining this with the magnetic heading of the aircraft and the ground speed of the aircraft, we can actually do much better trajectory plotting by doing essentially just reckoning. For each frame, taking the magnetic heading and the ground speed, combine them using this great circle function to actually plot where the aircraft went. Because we know it touched down on the runway and we've worked out to some reasonable accuracy that it touched down at a particular point on the runway. So we can work forward and back to then plot the ground track of that aircraft on the runway. So if I now go I'm going to start closing these down because I want to get really confused. So there we go. We can plot where the aircraft went. So you can see we've got this little carrot, which there's a little bit of HTML and a little iframe in a little pop-up within the Folium library. I will try to get that code circulated. It's fantastic. So you can see we've got it's 327 meters after the aim point that it actually touched down, which is a little bit deep. And then because we've been able to reconstruct the trajectory using that GeoPy library, you can see that the blue, which is the fitted, is much closer, and in terms of general shape, is actually a very good match for the underlying taxiway. And you can see I've got these yellow carrots to show where the thrust reversers were deployed and stowed again. And if we go to this little layer control, this is one of the other things that is the combination of the OverPy library and the Folium library and GeoPen is absolutely fantastic because you can have these other layers. So I can actually have these markers, and this is actually the precision approach point indicator lights. So you can have all this other very good context for trying to understand what's happening, why, and you can turn it on and off when you don't need it. Folium is fantastic. So the end result was that we got quite a reasonable root mean square improvement by doing this translation and matching the terrain, which meant that we got quite a nice distribution. It's not necessarily a normal distribution, but you can see we got anywhere from landing short by about 200 meters to landing long by about 300 meters. And yeah, it's nice. Is it accurate? No idea. This is where we get into one of the other things, and that I've now derived from flight data, which is relatively low frequency, and as we know, has some variables which are relatively low accuracy. Some estimate for how long or short a particular distribution of aircraft landed at a particular runway. But we need to go a little bit further than that. What we need to do is we need to have some understanding of what's the error in this calculation. and does this work for other airfields? So what we need to go is we need to go from the 2D case where we've just got the terrain for the approach to one particular runway to 3D where we can generate it from the actual digital terrain map, and then doing automated generation where we've got the digital surface map and the digital terrain map from people like Ordnance Survey, and very kindly from people like NASA who did what's called SRTM, which is the Shuttle Radar Topography mission where they had a radio altimeter, much like the aircraft, in the payload bay of the shuttle, and they just orbited the Earth and scanned the whole thing. It looks a little bit like a waffle because there's bits that were missed out. So there's these gaps between the swathes where the shuttle flew over and got radar topography, but it's actually very good data. It's not the finest detail, but it's quite good. If you have some money, you can get the Ordnance Survey. They'll give you very fine detail with 5-meter interval points, which is very good data, and I've been very lucky they've given me some of that. But then you have to actually deal with it, and if you're getting fine detailed data, you start needing to use other things like C++. For that, I can use the Godot library, which is, it's a Python library that calls C++ functions, so I don't need to touch any of that. And so I can start using the GeoPandas functions for geometry collections, where I've taken the taxiways, which I got from OpenStreetMap using the OverPy library, and I can buffer them to get all the area around them, and then I can subtract all the different taxiways, so I can identify each taxiway individually, and then I can use those as a filter using Godot to get only those points within the digital terrain map, for example, for this taxiway, but also because I'm storing the flight trajectory as a GeoJSON, I can also use that as a filter in Godot to get only those digital terrain map points within the footprint of that GeoJSON plus a little buffer, so I can then do much more accurate mapping and terrain matching. Godot's a little bit fiddly to install, but it's a very useful library for working with this very high volume digital terrain models. So this is what I'm doing to do so now that I've got more ways to confuse everything by having high amounts of data, this is what I'm doing to do validation on the other end. So I'm using those taxiways as my validation method. By seeing how well the ground trajectory matches up with the taxiways, I can then do a comparison. And again, using a very similar translation, but also including some rotation, I can work out how well the aircraft taxiing on the actual airport matches up with the known locations of the taxiways, which, unlike the aircraft, don't move around. And they don't tend to change very often, so it's quite a good data set. And again, we get it from the OpenStreetMap library. And again, we're using shaping, and it's absolutely fantastic. This is the most autonomous and possibly one of the more intelligent aircraft ever created, Project Pelican. And that was a brief run through of flight data analysis using Python and trying to work out where the hell we actually landed. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
I can imagine that your data gets incredibly noisy. So are you using different Python processes to kind of scrub that data, or can you go in a little bit more detail about how you're scrubbing those?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, the data ends up in an intermediary form. Depending upon your preference, you can handle it like an SQL data frame where you can do like filtering or window averaging. I don't tend to because although there is a lot of noise, the noise is all we've got. The stuff we want to remove is the gross artifacts, where it goes from being sitting on the runway and not moving at all, so it's just stuck at the gate, to recording data in the database of like Mach 2. I'm not kidding. I found points in data where a 737 believes it's going Mach 2. It's just not real. It's just because of an integer overflow, or it's where there's been some interleaving between two particular variables that weren't expected to change by the same magnitude at the same time. And so, well, it doesn't matter if these two collide. Well, they collided, and there we go. Some of the translators that go from the binary format to CSV or to SQL or whatever your flavor, they can noticed that. Some of them are better at handling that than others. It's not necessarily the more modern ones that are better at handling than others, but it's an ongoing process. I have a little bit of work to write a Python library to actually do that, but because the logical frame layout is a copyrighted thing, it kind of makes it more difficult because I can't distribute the LFL, so I'm one of the only people that can actually look at this data with the logical frame layouts, and I can't get other people to help me with it because they don't have the data.
There's one question here first.
Sorry, I was interested in that library you had for interacting with OpenStreetMap. I was wondering if that's open source or if that's some of the same.
It's one of many things you can just install via pip.
Perfect.
Python 3 compatible. OverPy is fantastic. Well, actually, I didn't show you the thing, but so this is what I was talking about with using taxiways to validate, because I can select only those points where the trajectory interacted with the buffer around a taxiway, so I can then match for individual taxiway subsegments, which then, with a bit of linear algebra, you can just do translation rotation and get a match. Yeah, OverPy is fantastic. Yes.
Hope you don't mind. In response to the first question, so there's lots of different types of invalid data that are found within parameters. So rate of change algorithms to look at whether or not it's changing faster than you'd expect, minimum max limits on parameters, correlation tests with other parameters, so you can see if it fits an expected gradient with another parameter. And there's various other things, but there's ARINC49 signals and all types of things which aren't valid data and would completely throw off certain algorithms.
Yeah, there is tons of stuff you can do to make it look pretty, but I try not to forget that it's crap data. Because you can make data look very pretty and give you only valid stuff, and when you're putting it as an input to an algorithm, you do want to do that. But when I'm plotting it for my own use to try and understand what's happening and where the error's coming from, I want to see it warts and all. But yes, you are quite right. There are some, there are a lot of tools for that in Python, especially in SciPy.
Do we have another question?
Is there no scope for using like the airport's radar system for altitude?
Well, some of you may have seen Flight Radar 24. There's various websites online, but they're one of them, where you can see where the aircraft are in real time, well, near real time. So that uses what's called secondary radar, where it's an ADS-B transponder, which is on the aircraft itself and gets illuminated by the radar, and every time it gets pulsed, it will respond saying, I'm this aircraft, I'm going in this direction to such and such destination airport, I'm at this altitude, at this speed, at this heading. And that's great, and that's what you'll get out as a kind of a live feed. But the reason those websites are able to display that data is because they can actually record it live by just listening in on the radio. Unfortunately, when it's logged by national entities, they don't share. And the airlines, don't get me started, the airlines are fantastic people, lovely people. They don't share either. In fact, they're more difficult to get data out of than national entities. The reason we have that data set at all is because that airline no longer operates, so we can't infringe the rights and the anonymities of the pilots.
Cool. Do we have any other questions?
What were the safety conclusions of your work then? What did you learn about pilot behavior?
I think the most important safety conclusion is that pilots are human. With that Canada incident, they should have done what's called TOGA, which is take off, go around, which is basically, we're going to try this again, lads. But TOGA isn't necessarily always the safest option. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a database so we can do base level statistical analysis of all the different approaches, all the different times they nearly went off the wrong way. Because at the moment, we can't detect that. This is the kind of tools we need to enable that basic research into all the times they nearly did something, but because nothing happened, there was no need to report it, so we don't have any evidence about whether it was good or bad. We don't know how close they were to something happening. Near-miss reporting is getting better, but is limited in terms of what's there at the moment. So this is what this type of thing will enable.
We have time for one or two more questions. There? No? Okay. Then I would like to thank our speaker, and you can take your belongings with you, please.